The London Route, Part 1. Upon completing her sixth form studies, Chenai joined the bandwagon to London. Many Zimbabwean students chose London as their study destination, and many of her friends had already gone this route. Her best friend Chenai, at whose house she would stay until she was able to rent her own place, was one of those who had already made London a home away from home. She had heard many tales about the UK, and naturally, she was eager, curious, and excited to be going to the melting pot of different nations. Several people told her how fortunate she was to be leaving what they described as the doom and gloom of Zimbabwe for the greener grass on the other side. Although she looked forward to studying abroad, she had never traveled anywhere without her family, and the thought of being parted from them for such a long period of time was overwhelming. Her mother consoled her and said that living on her own for the next 3 years would help to make her independent. Chenai was fortunate that her parents would finance her tuition fees for the first and second semesters as well as her living expenses, but she had to find a part-time job to fund herself for the rest of her studies as well as her living expenses. A few days before her departure, she dreamt of standing before an imposing cathedral that had astounding architecture. Little did she know that the cathedral that she saw in her dream was St. Paul's Cathedral, an Anglican cathedral, which is one of London's most beautiful and historically significant landmarks, which has hosted some royal events. She only realized this when she did an online search about the culture and history of London. This was a great surprise to her, and it unnerved her that during her sleep, her soul had left her body and traveled to London and seen St. Paul's Cathedral before her travel. The day of Chenai's departure finally arrived. Her parents and siblings escorted her to the airport, and after the final goodbyes to her family, she walked through the security checkpoint and her family waved to her until she disappeared from their view. To kill time during the 12-hour flight from Harare to London, Chenai switched between bouts of sleep and reading the 4 novels which she'd brought along. She was reading the 4th novel when the pilot announced over the PA system that the plane would soon be descending to Gatwick Airport, and she clipped on her seat belt as the plane began its descent. She looked out the window of the plane and got her first glimpse of London. She couldn't believe she was finally in London, where thousands of Zimbabweans back home were dying to be. The plane landed at London Gatwick International Airport, and passengers disembarked and headed to the border control, where she joined the long queue to undergo immigration check and clearance. "It's time to be grilled," a young man, whom she had traveled with all the way from Zimbabwe, whispered to her. She had read stories about Zimbabweans complaining that UK immigration officers were very tough on Zimbabweans. Because of the alleged stories, she was very anxious, and she hoped against hope that she would not suffer this kind of treatment. Looking around, Chenai noticed that some Zimbabweans looked visibly nervous, and she guessed that they were saying their last-minute prayers before the immigration check. She could sense the tension around. Some Zimbabweans were successfully cleared, and she saw others being led away by immigration officials for further questioning. Some of them were visibly crying because they had been denied entry and would be detained pending removal from the UK. When it was Chenai's turn, she walked up to the immigration desk and handed the immigration officer her passport and all her relevant documents. The immigration officer looked at her passport photo and back at her face, and he looked in doubt. "You don't look like your passport photo," the immigration officer told her. "The difference is so much that I can't determine whether you're the person whose passport I'm checking," he added. Chenai panicked and her heart began racing. She tried to explain what she thought could be the reason that she didn't look like her passport photo, and the immigration officer listened doubtfully. He then told her that he was going to ask for advice from his superior and left the counter. He returned with his superior, who looked at the passport photo and back at Chenai's face. The 2 immigration officers then moved aside and conversed for a short while. Then the first immigration officer returned to his counter and said to Chenai, "My boss has agreed that we accept your passport. But it's crucial that your passport is renewed with a current photo. That's because current passport photos determine whether the person whose passport we're checking is the person who is standing before us." The immigration officer then went on to ask Chenai what the purpose of her coming to the UK was, and she explained that she was coming to study. The immigration official verified her study visa, and it was to Chenai's relief when he stamped her passport and told her, "You have permission to enter the UK." Chenai walked through and proceeded to the baggage claim area and retrieved her luggage and loaded it onto a trolley, then walked out into the arrivals lounge, where her friend Tendai was waiting to welcome her. As Chenai wheeled her trolley into the arrivals lounge, Tendai ran towards her with outstretched arms and they hugged and giggled with delight. "Welcome to London," Tendai said, as she wheeled Chenai's trolley to a ticket booth, where she purchased 2 train tickets to London Victoria Station, a major underground station, which connects London with London Gatwick Airport. At London Victoria Station, Chenai and Tendai would change for a train to Central London Station, where they would board yet another train to Forest Gate Station and finally board a bus to Forest Gate Borough where Tendai lived. At London Victoria Station, Chenai laid her eyes on the London Underground for the first time and she was mesmerised by it. Tendai told her that the London Underground, which covered much of Greater London, was the fastest mode of transport because there was so much traffic on London roads, which translated to major delays. She was bewildered as escalators took them up and down and they walked and turned several corners before they arrived at the platform where they would board a tube train destined for Central London Station. Chenai was mesmerised by the dark tunnel from where the tube train would emerge at top speed. Shortly after, a tube train emerged from the dark tunnel and stopped at the platform. All the carriage doors opened simultaneously and passengers filed out of the tube train while other passengers boarded. As she boarded the tube train, Chenai heard the famous words, "Mind the gap," for the very first time. During the ride to Central London Station, the tube train twisted and turned in the dark underground tunnel. At Central London Station, escalators took Chenai and Tendai up and down and they also walked up and down flights of steps and turned several corners before they arrived at the platform where they would board a tube train to Stratford Station. As they waited for the arrival of the tube train, Tendai told Chenai that above London Victoria Station was London's business and most crowded street, which was called Oxford Street, where many of London's designer stores were located. The world-famous red double-decker buses, which ply many different London routes, start and end along Oxford Street, Tendai also told Chenai. "Is the Harrods store also located along Oxford Street?" Chenai asked. Harrods store is not located along Oxford Street but close by in an area called Knightsbridge, Tendai told her. When Chenai and Tendai arrived at Stratford Station, Chenai was greeted with blistering cold. She realized that she had not felt the cold when they were on the London Underground because of the central heating. Now that they were outside, the cold penetrated through her light clothing. Her arms and legs were filled with cold goosebumps and her body shook from the cold. "Let's go and buy you some layers of clothing before you freeze to death," Tendai said. Chenai had read on the internet that Londoners wore layers of clothing to keep warm and she noticed this as they walked to the shopping mall. The people she saw were dressed in either grey or black clothing. They wore a heavy jacket or coat above a fleece sweater, thermal thick tights, boots that covered their legs up to the knees, woolly hats, scarves, gloves, and earmuffs. Some people draped what looked like small blankets around their shoulders. When Chenai was all layered up, they walked back to the bus station and boarded a red double-decker bus which was destined for Forest Gate Borough. End of part 1.